In the mists of time, when the world was young and the great forests of Mesoamerica stretched endlessly beneath azure skies, there emerged from the primitive darkness a people destined for greatness. The Maya, whose name would echo through the corridors of history like thunder across mountain peaks, began their extraordinary journey not with the clash of bronze or the roar of conquest, but with the simple, profound act of planting seeds in fertile earth. The year was approximately 8000 BC, when the first wandering bands of hunter-gatherers ventured into the lush lowlands that would become the heartland of Maya civilization. These were not yet the builders of soaring pyramids or the masters of celestial mathematics, but humble souls who carried within their weathered hands the potential for empire. They moved like shadows through valleys thick with cecropia trees and strangler figs, following game trails that wound between limestone hills destined to bear the weight of temples. For millennia, these ancient peoples lived as their ancestors had lived, tracking deer through morning mists, gathering wild fruits beneath canopies so dense that noon seemed like twilight, fishing in rivers that ran crystal clear over beds of white stone. Yet, even in these primordial days, the seeds of transformation were stirring. Around 7000 BC, the first tentative experiments with agriculture began to take root along the fertile coastal plains of the Pacific. The transformation was not sudden like lightning splitting the night sky, but gradual as the changing of seasons. Generation by generation, the wandering bands began to linger longer in places where the earth proved generous. They learned to coax sustenance from wild teosinte, the humble grass that would evolve into maize, the golden grain that would feed empires. They discovered the secrets of squash and beans, of chili peppers that burned like tiny suns upon the tongue. By 3500 BC, the first permanent settlements began to dot the landscape like stars emerging in the evening sky. These were modest affairs, clusters of thatched huts arranged around central plazas where children played and elders shared stories of the old days when their people moved with the seasons. Yet, even in their simplicity, these villages carried the DNA of greatness. The circular arrangement of dwellings, the central sacred space, the careful orientation toward cardinal directions, all these elements would later bloom into the magnificent urban centers that would astound the world. The people themselves were changing too, shaped by their intimate relationship with the rhythms of planting and harvest. Where once they had moved in small bands bound by blood and necessity, now they began to form larger communities united by shared labor and common purpose. The egalitarian ways of the hunter-gatherer gave way to the first stirrings of social hierarchy, as some individuals demonstrated particular skill in organizing communal work or communicating with the spirits of rain and earth. Around 2600 BC, in the settlement of Cuello, in what would later be called Belize, archaeologists would uncover evidence of sophisticated ceramic traditions and the earliest traces of monumental architecture. The pottery of these ancient Maya was not merely functional, but beautiful, decorated with intricate patterns that spoke of aesthetic sensibilities already reaching toward the sublime. Red and cream slips adorned vessels that held not just food and water, but the hopes and dreams of a people beginning to imagine themselves as something more than mere survivors. The cultivation of maize, that sacred grain which the Maya would later believe formed the very flesh of humanity, reached new levels of sophistication during this period. No longer content with simply scattering wild seeds and hoping for the best, the early Maya developed techniques of field rotation, intercropping, and selective breeding that would sustain populations far larger than the land had ever supported before. With abundance came leisure, and with leisure came the luxury of contemplation, of art, of dreaming dreams larger than the simple necessities of survival. As the second millennium BC dawned, the scattered villages of the Maya began to stir with new energies. Trade networks, fragile as spider webs, but strong as steel cables, began to connect distant communities. Obsidian from highland volcanoes found its way to lowland workshops, while jade from hidden quarries traveled paths that would later become highways between city-states. Shell from distant oceans adorned the bodies of emerging elites, marking the first visible distinctions of rank and privilege that would eventually crystallize into the divine kingship of later ages. The spiritual life of these early Maya was rich with mystery and meaning. They worshipped deities of rain and earth, of sun and moon, of the great Cecropia tree that connected the underworld with the heavens above. Shamans began to emerge as intermediaries between the human and divine realms, their minds expanded by sacred plants that grew in the depths of the forest. In caves that penetrated deep into the limestone bedrock, they conducted rituals that would echo through thousands of years of Maya religious practice. By 2000 BC, the stage was set for the great drama that would unfold over the next 3 millennia. The Maya had mastered the fundamentals of agriculture, established the basic patterns of settlement and society, and begun to develop the spiritual and artistic traditions that would distinguish their civilization from all others. They stood poised on the threshold of greatness, like actors waiting in the wings for their cue to enter the grand theater of history. The jungle watched and waited, its ancient trees witnesses to the stirring of a people who would one day read the movements of planets with mathematical precision, build cities that touched the clouds, and create written language that captured the very breath of gods. The seeds had been planted. Now it was time for them to grow. As the centuries rolled forward like great waves across the shore of time, the Maya settlements began to pulse with new rhythms of growth and transformation. The year 2000 BC marked not an ending, but a magnificent beginning, as the scattered communities of maize farmers and jade workers started to coalesce into something unprecedented in the history of Mesoamerica. The first stirrings of what would become the greatest indigenous civilization the New World had ever known. In the fertile lowlands of the Petén, where morning mists clung to towering Cecropia trees like the breath of sleeping gods, villages began to swell beyond their original boundaries. What had once been modest clusters of family compounds grew into sprawling settlements that housed hundreds, then thousands of souls united by common purpose and shared destiny. The transformation was not merely one of size, but of fundamental character. The Maya were becoming something new under the sun. The settlement of Nakbi, rising from the jungle floor like a mountain born of human ambition, became the first great center to display the architectural audacity that would become the hallmark of Maya civilization. Around 1000 BC, its builders began to raise massive stone platforms that dwarfed anything their ancestors had imagined possible. These were not mere buildings, but statements written in limestone and mortar declarations that humanity could reach toward the heavens and make the earth itself a canvas for divine expression. The construction of these early monuments required innovations that would echo through millennia of Maya engineering. Teams of workers organized with military precision quarried limestone from sacred cenotes and hauled massive blocks across distances that would challenge modern machinery. They developed techniques of corbel vaulting that allowed them to span vast interior spaces without the aid of true arches, creating chambers that seemed to breathe with mysterious power. Most remarkably, they achieved all this without beasts of burden, without wheels, without metal tools, only human muscle guided by vision and will. As Nakbe rose toward the canopy, other centers began to stir with similar ambitions. El Mirador, destined to become the largest pre-classic city in the Maya world, started its own journey toward monumentality around 600 BC. Its builders would eventually raise pyramid complexes so vast that they could be seen from space triumphs of engineering that demonstrated the growing sophistication of Maya society and the increasing power of its rulers. The emergence of these urban centers marked a fundamental shift in Maya social organization, where once egalitarian communities had made decisions through consensus and tradition. Now hierarchical societies began to crystallize around emerging elites who claimed special relationships with the gods. These early lords, adorned with jade ornaments that captured the green fire of sacred mountains and the eternal promise of maize, began to commission monuments that celebrated their divine mandate to rule. The iconography that emerged during this period would become the visual language of Maya kingship for centuries to come. Jaguars, those spotted lords of the forest whose roars could shake the very foundations of the earth, became symbols of royal power and supernatural authority. Serpents, both feathered and scaled, represented the cosmic forces that connected the watery underworld with the celestial realm above. The Cecropia tree, whose towering trunk pierced multiple layers of forest canopy, became the axis mundi that centered the Maya cosmos and legitimized the position of kings as intermediaries between mortal and divine realms. Trade networks, which had begun as simple exchanges between neighboring villages, evolved into sophisticated commercial systems that spanned hundreds of miles. Merchants traveling in organized caravans along paths that would later become the highways between great cities carried more than mere goods. They transported ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and religious concepts that would bind the Maya world together in webs of shared culture. Cacao beans, those precious seeds that the Maya believed contained the essence of the gods themselves, began to serve as standardized currency in markets that buzzed with polyglot voices, speaking a dozen different Maya dialects. The intellectual achievements of this period were no less remarkable than the material ones. Maya astronomers, working without telescopes or mechanical clocks, began to track the movements of celestial bodies with precision that would not be surpassed until the advent of modern instruments. They observed that Venus disappeared and reappeared according to predictable cycles, that solar eclipses followed mathematical patterns, that the moon waxed and waned in harmony with the sacred count of days that governed all human activity. From these observations emerged the first versions of the Maya calendar systems that would eventually become the most sophisticated chronological framework ever developed by an indigenous American civilization. The sacred round of 260 days, combining 20-day names with 13 numbers in endless permutation, provided a ritual calendar that governed everything from agricultural activities to royal ceremonies. The solar year of 365 days tracked the movement of seasons with accuracy that rivaled modern calculations. Most remarkably, the long count system began to take shape, a mathematical framework capable of expressing dates millions of years into the past and future with absolute precision. Writing that most precious of human inventions began to emerge from the interplay of artistic expression and administrative necessity. The earliest Maya glyphs, carved into stone monuments and painted on ceramic vessels, combined logographic and syllabic elements in a system of unprecedented complexity and beauty. These were not mere utilitarian markings, but artistic creations that transformed the very act of reading into a kind of sacred performance, where meaning unfolded through the interaction of image and sound, symbol and story. The spiritual life of the Maya during this period reached new heights of sophistication and complexity. The pantheon of deities, which had begun with simple personifications of natural forces, evolved into an elaborate cosmological system populated by gods, whose relationships and adventures formed an epic mythology comparable to those of ancient Greece or Mesopotamia. Itzamna, the creator deity whose name meant iguana house, presided over a cosmic order where divine intervention in human affairs was not exceptional but constant and necessary. Ritual bloodletting, the sacred practice by which Maya rulers communed directly with their deified ancestors, became increasingly elaborate and public. Kings and queens adorned in costume that transformed them into living embodiments of cosmic forces, pierced their tongues and genitals with obsidian blades and stingray spines, allowing their sacred blood to flow onto bark paper that was then burned to create smoke that carried their prayers to the other world. These ceremonies, conducted on pyramid tops, beneath skies brilliant with stars, demonstrated the awesome responsibilities and privileges of divine kingship. By 400 BC, the Maya had established the fundamental patterns of civilization that would guide their development for the next millennium and beyond. They had created urban centers of unprecedented scale and grandeur, developed systems of writing and calendrical calculation that captured the very rhythms of cosmic time, and established trade networks that connected distant regions in bonds of mutual prosperity. Most importantly, they had forged a unique vision of human potential that saw earthly rulers as partners with celestial gods in the ongoing work of creation itself. The stage was now set for the next great chapter in their extraordinary story, the classical period that would see the Maya civilization reach heights of achievement that would astonish the world and establish them forever as one of humanity's greatest cultural accomplishments. In the twilight years of the second millennium before the Christian era, the Maya world began to pulse with new rhythms like a great heart awakening from ancient slumber. The humble farming villages that had dotted the landscape for centuries were transforming into something unprecedented in the Americas. Complex societies centered around monumental architecture that reached toward the heavens with unprecedented ambition. The first great flowering occurred in the Mirador Basin of northern Guatemala, where, around 1000 BC, the settlement of Nakbe began its ascent toward magnificence. Here, among the endless green canopy of the Petén rainforest, Maya architects and laborers embarked upon projects that would have seemed impossible to their ancestors. Using nothing but human muscle rope and ingenuity, they began to pile limestone blocks into structures that rose above the forest floor like geometric mountains, their surfaces gleaming white with lime plaster that caught and reflected the tropical sun. These early ceremonial centers were not merely buildings, but manifestos written in stone declarations that humanity could transcend the horizontal plane of mere existence and reach upward toward the realm of gods. The pyramids of Nakbe, though modest by later standards, represented a conceptual revolution as profound as the invention of writing itself. They transformed the Maya landscape from a world where all human activity occurred at ground level into a three-dimensional theater where ritual drama could unfold against the backdrop of sky and cloud. As Nakbe flourished, other centers began to emerge across the Maya world like flowers blooming after seasonal rains. El Mirador, destined to become the first true Maya metropolis, began its rise around 600 BC with constructions that would dwarf even the mighty pyramids of Egypt. The Danta complex at El Mirador, when measured from its base to its summit, would eventually reach a height of 230 feet, making it one of the largest structures ever built in the pre-Columbian Americas. The society that created these architectural marvels was itself undergoing profound transformation. The egalitarian communities of earlier centuries gave way to increasingly stratified societies where birth talent and divine favor determined one's place in an elaborate social hierarchy. At the apex stood figures who were part king, part high priest, part divine intermediary, rulers who claimed direct descent from the gods themselves and wielded power that was both temporal and spiritual. These emerging kings surrounded themselves with courts of specialists whose very existence testified to the growing complexity of Maya civilization. Scribes began to develop the first tentative forms of Maya writing, using pictographic symbols to record the deeds of rulers and the movements of celestial bodies. Artisans created works of breathtaking beauty, carving jade into miniature masterpieces and fashioning ceramic vessels whose elegant forms spoke of aesthetic traditions reaching toward perfection. The spiritual world of the Maya was expanding as dramatically as their physical constructions. The simple agricultural deities of earlier centuries were joined by increasingly sophisticated pantheons that reflected the growing complexity of Maya society. Itzamna, the creator god, presided over a cosmic order that was both beautiful and terrible, while the maize god embodied the agricultural abundance that made civilization possible. Ka'inich Ajor, the sun god, began his daily journey across the sky in rituals that were reenacted in temple courtyards with growing elaboration and theatrical grandeur. Trade networks that had once been simple exchanges between neighboring villages evolved into commercial arteries that connected the Maya world with distant civilizations. Obsidian from the volcanic highlands traveled hundreds of miles to lowland workshops, while cacao beans from Pacific coastal regions began their journey toward becoming the currency of kings. Most precious of all was jade, the green stone that the Maya valued more highly than gold, which arrived from the serpentine deposits of the Motagua Valley along trade routes that required diplomatic agreements between emerging city-states. The period between 400 BC and 250 AD witnessed the emergence of what archaeologists would later call the late pre-classic florescence, a time when Maya civilization achieved levels of sophistication that would not be surpassed for centuries. At El Mirador, a city that may have housed 100,000 inhabitants at its peak, massive causeways connected ceremonial complexes across miles of jungle terrain. These raised roadways, some wide enough for processions of hundreds of participants, demonstrated engineering capabilities that rivaled those of Rome and required organizational skills that could only have existed in a state-level society. The artwork of this period reveals a people coming into full possession of their cultural identity. Sculpture began to appear on temple facades, depicting mythological scenes and royal portraits with increasing naturalism and emotional power. The famous frieze at El Mirador shows swimmers diving through stylized water, their bodies captured in moments of graceful motion that speak to artistic traditions of extraordinary sophistication. Writing systems still largely pictographic, but showing increasing phonetic elements, began to record not just religious and astronomical information, but historical events and royal genealogies. The earliest dated Maya monuments, such as the famous Stela 29 from Tikal, demonstrate that by the 3rd century AD, the Maya had developed one of the most accurate calendar systems in human history, capable of tracking time across millennia with mathematical precision that would not be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. The religious architecture of this period reveals increasingly complex cosmological concepts. Temple pyramids were not simply tall buildings, but three-dimensional models of the Maya universe, with their platforms representing the layers of the underworld, their rising steps symbolizing the ascent from death to rebirth, and their summit temples serving as portals to the celestial realm where gods dwelt in eternal splendor. As the late pre-classic period drew to a close around 250 AD, the Maya world was poised for its greatest achievements. The foundations had been laid in stone and custom, in agricultural technique and artistic tradition, in mathematical understanding and spiritual insight. The great city-states that would dominate the classic period were already taking shape, their future rivalries and alliances beginning to form like storm clouds gathering on distant horizons. Yet even as they reached toward unprecedented heights of achievement, the Maya of this period could not have imagined the challenges that lay ahead. Climate change warfare, political instability, and the hubris that comes with great power would test their civilization in ways that would ultimately reshape their entire world. But for now, in these closing centuries of the pre-classic era, they stood triumphant masters of a civilization that had transformed jungle wilderness into urban paradise, creators of art and architecture that would inspire wonder for millennia to come. The seeds planted by their ancestors had grown into mighty trees, their branches reaching toward the stars, their roots extending deep into the sacred earth that had nurtured them from their earliest beginnings. As the 3rd century of the Common Era dawned across the Maya world, the ancient prophecies seemed to stir with new life, and the very stones of temple pyramids hummed with anticipation. The foundations laid by their ancestors over centuries of patient labor were about to support the most magnificent civilization the Americas had ever witnessed. This was the moment when the Maya would step fully into the light of history, transforming from promising builders into the undisputed masters of Mesoamerican culture. The transition from the late pre-classic to the classic period around 250 AD was not marked by conquest or catastrophe, but by a flowering of human potential so remarkable that its achievements would echo through the corridors of time until the end of days. Across the sprawling lowlands of Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and southern Mexico, dozens of city-states began to rise like jewels scattered across a green velvet landscape, each one a masterpiece of urban planning, architectural innovation, and artistic expression. Tikal, the mighty city that would become synonymous with Maya greatness, began its ascent toward supremacy during these transformative centuries. located in the heart of the Petén rainforest, where jaguars still prowled ancient paths and howler monkeys announced the dawn with voices that carried for miles. Tikal emerged as a center of power that would dominate the central Maya lowlands for over 6 centuries. Its rulers, beginning with the semi-legendary Yaks-Abe-Suk in the late 3rd century, established dynasties that would trace their lineages back to the very gods themselves. The city's ceremonial core, spreading across hundreds of acres of carefully modified landscape, became a stone testament to Maya engineering genius. Temple Y, known to archaeologists as the Temple of the Great Jaguar, rose 154 feet above the forest floor, its steep-sided pyramid crowned with a temple whose corbel vaulted chambers housed in the tomb of Jasor Chan Kawil I, one of Tikal's greatest rulers. When completed around 734 AD, this architectural marvel stood as one of the tallest structures in the pre-Columbian Americas, visible from miles away, and serving as a beacon that proclaimed Tikal's power to all who approached. But Tikal was not alone in its ambitions. Across the Maya world, other city-states were pursuing their own visions of grandeur with equal determination and creativity. Palenque, nestled against the foothills of the Chiapas Mountains, where morning mists created a mystical atmosphere worthy of the gods, themselves developed an architectural style of such elegance and refinement that modern visitors still gasp in wonder at its beauty. The palace complex at Palenque, with its unique 4-story tower and intricate maze of courtyards and chambers, demonstrated Maya architectural sophistication that would not be equaled in Europe for centuries. The Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque, serving as the funerary monument for the great ruler Kainich Janab Pakal'le, contained one of the longest hieroglyphic texts ever created by the ancient Maya. This incredible document, carved into stone panels with precision that rivals the finest modern craftsmanship, recorded not just the deeds of kings but the creation myths and cosmological beliefs that formed the foundation of Maya civilization. When archaeologists finally deciphered these inscriptions in the 20th century, they revealed a level of historical consciousness and literary sophistication that placed the Maya among the most intellectually advanced civilizations in human history. Copan, located in the southeastern periphery of the Maya world in what is now Honduras, specialized in sculptures of such artistic merit that the city became known as the Athens of the Maya world. The hieroglyphic stairway at Copan, completed in the 8th century AD, contained over 2,500 individual glyph blocks that formed the longest Maya text known to exist. This monumental inscription, climbing the steps of Temple 26 like a river of meaning, flowing upward toward the heavens, recorded the dynastic history of Copan's rulers, while simultaneously serving as a masterwork of literary and artistic achievement. The rulers who governed these magnificent cities were not mere political leaders, but god-kings whose every action carried cosmic significance. They underwent elaborate coronation ceremonies that transformed them into living embodiments of divine power, donning jade ornaments and feathered costumes that marked their transition from mortal men into sacred intermediaries between the human and supernatural realms. Their palaces, built around courtyards that served as stages for royal theatre, became the centers of courtly life, where artists, scribes, astronomers, and noble families gathered to participate in the grand drama of Maya civilization. The mathematical and astronomical achievements of the classic period. Maya reached levels that would not be surpassed anywhere in the world, for centuries. Their calendar system, perfected during this era, demonstrated a level of temporal precision that modern scientists find almost incomprehensible. The Maya calculated the length of the solar year as 365 by 420 days, a figure that differs from modern measurements by only 0.02 days. Their calculations of Venus cycles were accurate to within hours over periods of centuries, and their eclipse predictions demonstrated understanding of lunar mechanics that European astronomers would not achieve until the Renaissance. The long count calendar, which tracked time from a mythical creation date in 3114 BC, allowed Maya scribes to record historical events with absolute chronological precision. This system, based on a modified vigesimal base 20 mathematical framework that included the concept of 0 centuries before it appeared in the Old World, enabled the Maya to think in terms of vast cycles of time that encompassed not just human history but cosmic epochs stretching across millions of years. Maya writing reached its full flowering during the Classic period, evolving into the most sophisticated system of graphic communication ever developed in the pre-Columbian Americas. The script combined logographic signs representing entire words with syllabic signs representing individual sounds, creating a flexible system capable of recording the full range of Maya languages with remarkable precision. Master scribes, who underwent decades of training to master this complex system, created texts of extraordinary beauty that combined meaning and visual impact in ways that made reading itself a form of artistic performance. The subject matter of these texts reveals a civilization of remarkable intellectual depth and cultural sophistication. Royal chronicles recorded the births, accessions, marriages, military victories and deaths of rulers with meticulous attention to astronomical timing and ritual significance. Mythological texts preserved creation stories and divine adventures that provided the cosmological framework for Maya religion. Historical inscriptions documented political alliances, territorial conquests, and dynastic marriages that shaped the constantly shifting balance of power between competing city-states. Trade networks during the Classic period became so extensive and sophisticated that they created what amounted to a Maya common market stretching from central Mexico to Honduras. Merchants protected by diplomatic agreements between city-states carried goods along established routes that connected highland and lowland regions in mutually beneficial relationships. Obsidian blades, manufactured in Teotihuacan workshops, found their way to Maya courts hundreds of miles away, while Maya cacao and jade appeared in archaeological contexts throughout Mesoamerica. The artistic achievements of Classic period Maya reached heights that placed them among the greatest aesthetic traditions in human history. Sculptors created portraits of rulers and gods with psychological depth and emotional power that rivals the finest work of classical antiquity. Painters decorated palace walls and ceramic vessels with scenes of mythological drama and courtly life rendered with technique and imagination that speaks to artistic traditions of extraordinary sophistication. As the Classic period unfolded like a magnificent tapestry woven from threads of gold and jade, the Maya world became a stage upon which the greatest drama of pre-Columbian civilization played out in acts of stunning complexity and breathtaking grandeur. The city-states that had emerged as centers of power during the early centuries AD now matured into sophisticated political entities whose rivalries and alliances would shape the destiny of millions of souls across the sprawling landscape of Mesoamerica. The political landscape of the classic Maya world resembled a chess game played by gods, where each move carried consequences that rippled across generations and shaped the fate of entire dynasties. At the apex of this complex system stood the great regional powers Tikal and Calakmul, locked in a rivalry so intense and enduring that it would define Maya politics for centuries. These two superpowers, separated by hundreds of miles of dense jungle, but united in their ambition to dominate the Maya world, created spheres of influence that drew dozens of smaller city-states into their orbits like planets circling competing suns. Calakmul, the mighty Snake Kingdom, whose emblem glyph depicted the head of a serpent wreathed in royal insignia, emerged as Tikal's primary rival during the 6th century AD. Located deep in the Campeche rainforest, where ancient cecropia trees created cathedral-like spaces beneath canopies so dense that daylight filtered through in mysterious patterns, Calakmul built a city of unprecedented scale and ambition. Structure 2 at Calakmul, rising 180 feet above the forest floor, stood as one of the largest pyramids ever constructed by the ancient Maya, a monument to royal power that could be seen for miles across the flat expanse of the Petén. The rulers of Calakmul pursued an aggressive policy of expansion and alliance building that brought them into direct conflict with Tikal's own imperial ambitions. Through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic marriage, and economic pressure, the Snake Kings extended their influence across vast territories, creating a network of client states and allied cities that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Caribbean coast. The most famous of these rulers, Uknum Chin II, known to history as Uknum the Great, orchestrated military campaigns and political intrigues that demonstrated strategic thinking worthy of the greatest military minds in human history. The warfare that erupted between these competing powers was unlike anything seen before in the Maya world. Earlier conflicts had been relatively small-scale affairs designed to capture prisoners for sacrifice or to seize tribute from weaker neighbors. But the wars of the late Classic period were struggles for hegemony that involved massive armies, sophisticated siege tactics, and campaigns that could last for years. Maya warriors adorned in cotton armor and wielding obsidian-edged clubs and spear throwers fought battles whose outcomes determined the fate of entire regions. The most dramatic moment in this epic struggle occurred in 562 AD when Calakmul and its allies achieved a stunning victory over Tikal, capturing or killing the great king Wak Chan Ka'awil and bringing to an end Tikal's first golden age. For over a century, Tikal would remain subordinate to its great rival. Its monuments, silent, its ambitious building programs halted its royal dynasty, humbled but not broken. This period, known to archaeologists as the Tikal hiatus, demonstrates the decisive impact that warfare could have on even the mightiest Maya cities. Yet, the story of Maya warfare was not simply one of destruction and defeat. The constant pressure of competition drove technological and tactical innovations that made Maya armies among the most effective fighting forces in the pre-Columbian Americas. They developed sophisticated logistic systems that allowed them to supply armies operating hundreds of miles from home base. They created intelligence networks that provided detailed information about enemy movements and intentions. Most importantly, they learned to coordinate land and water operations using the extensive river systems of the Maya lowlands to transport troops and supplies with speed and efficiency that their enemies could not match. The religious dimension of Maya warfare elevated these conflicts far beyond mere political struggles into cosmic dramas where earthly kings served as representatives of celestial forces locked in eternal combat. Before major battles, priests conducted elaborate rituals designed to ensure divine favor, including bloodletting ceremonies where rulers pierced their tongues and genitals with stingray spines and obsidian blades. The blood that flowed from these sacred wounds was collected on bark paper and burned to create smoke that carried prayers and offerings to the gods who determined the outcome of human conflicts. Captives taken in these wars faced fates that reveal the profound spiritual significance Maya culture attached to ritual violence. Noble prisoners, especially rival kings, and their close relatives were reserved for the most elaborate sacrifice ceremonies conducted on pyramid tops before crowds of thousands during festivals that could last for days. These rituals, far from being mere displays of cruelty, were understood as necessary acts that maintained the cosmic order and ensured the continued favor of gods who demanded human blood as payment for their protection and benevolence. The daily life of ordinary Maya during the classic period unfolded against this backdrop of political drama and religious intensity. Yet it was characterized by achievements in agriculture, craftsmanship, and social organization that made possible the spectacular accomplishments of their rulers. Maya farmers, working with tools of stone and wood in landscapes that challenged even modern agricultural techniques, developed farming systems of remarkable sophistication and productivity. The raised field systems of northern Belize and the Candelaria River region transformed seasonal swamplands into year-round agricultural zones capable of supporting population densities that rivaled those of modern industrial societies. These ingenious constructions involving the excavation of canals and the building up of planting surfaces using rich muck from wetland environments created micro-environments where crops could flourish even during the most challenging seasons. The fish that flourished in the canal systems provided protein to supplement diets based primarily on maize beans and squash, while the organic matter that accumulated in these waterways created a renewable source of fertilizer that maintained soil productivity across centuries of intensive cultivation. In the highland regions, Maya agriculturalists developed terrace systems that transformed steep mountainsides into productive farmland, while preventing the soil erosion that had destroyed earlier civilizations in similar environments. These terraces, built with careful attention to drainage and soil retention, supported agricultural communities at elevations where farming would seem impossible to modern observers. The integration of tree crops like cacao and ramon with annual plants like maize created polyculture systems that maximize productivity while maintaining ecological stability. The craft specialization that characterized classic period Maya society reached levels of sophistication that placed Maya artisans among the most skilled in the ancient world. Jade carvers, working with tools of stone and wood, created ornaments of breathtaking beauty and technical perfection. The jade mask of Kinich Janab Pakal from Palenque, composed of hundreds of individually carved pieces, fitted together with precision that modern jewelers find difficult to match, represents the pinnacle of lapidary art in pre-Columbian America. Maya weavers, working primarily with cotton, grown in carefully tended fields, created textiles whose beauty and complexity can only be imagined from the stone sculptures and painted murals that preserve their images. The elaborate costumes worn by Maya rulers, featuring intricate patterns rendered in brilliant colors derived from local plants and minerals, required hundreds of hours of skilled labor and represented artistic traditions that had been refined over centuries of creative innovation. As the 8th century of the Common Era drew toward its close, the Maya world stood at the zenith of its power and glory. Yet beneath the surface of triumph, subtle tremors of change were beginning to disturb the foundations of a civilization that had seemed destined to endure forever. The great cities that had risen like stone flowers from the jungle floor continued their magnificent displays of royal power, their pyramids still piercing the sky with geometric perfection, their plazas still echoing with the chants of priests and the proclamations of divine kings. Yet, the very success that had carried the Maya to unprecedented heights was beginning to generate pressures that would test their civilization in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. The signs of stress were subtle at first, like hairline cracks in temple facades that could be noticed only by the most observant observers. Population levels across the Maya lowlands had reached densities that strained even the most sophisticated agricultural systems ever developed in the pre-Columbian Americas. Archaeological surveys revealed settlements spreading far beyond the ceremonial centers into previously unoccupied marginal lands where farmers struggled to coax sustenance from soils that their ancestors had wisely left to forest. The raised field systems that had sustained dense populations for centuries were beginning to show signs of declining productivity as centuries of intensive cultivation depleted the organic matter that had made them so remarkably fertile. Climate records preserved in lake sediments and cave formations began to tell a story of environmental stress that would have profound implications for Maya civilization. The late 8th and early 9th centuries witnessed the onset of the most severe drought in Mesoamerican history, a climatic catastrophe that reduced rainfall across the Maya lowlands by as much as 40% for extended periods. Rivers that had flowed year-round since time immemorial began to run dry during the traditional dry season, while the cenotes that had provided reliable water sources for countless generations dropped to levels that made access difficult or impossible. The political consequences of environmental stress were amplified by the very complexity that had made Maya civilization so remarkably successful. The intricate web of alliances and rivalries that connected dozens of city-states across hundreds of miles of territory had created a system of interdependence that could transmit shocks with devastating efficiency. When agricultural productivity declined in one region, the effects rippled outward through trade networks and tributary relationships, creating cascading failures that could destabilize entire political systems. The great rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul, which had driven political innovation and military development for centuries, began to take on increasingly desperate characteristics as both superpowers struggled to maintain their spheres of influence in the face of mounting environmental and demographic pressures. The wars of the 9th century were marked by a ferocity and destructiveness that exceeded even the legendary conflicts of earlier periods. Cities that had stood unconquered for centuries found themselves besieged by enemies who fought with the desperation of peoples facing extinction. Dos Pilas, one of Calakmul's most important client states in the Petex Betun region, experienced a trajectory that would become tragically familiar across the Maya world during this period. Founded in the 7th century as part of Calakmul's strategy to encircle and contain Tikal dos Pilas, had flourished for generations as a center of learning and artistic achievement. Its rulers commissioned some of the finest sculptures and hieroglyphic inscriptions of the late classic period, creating works of art that demonstrated the continuing vitality of Maya culture, even as external pressures mounted. Yet, by the late 8th century, Dos Pilas was locked in a series of conflicts with neighboring centers that would ultimately destroy the political order that had sustained it for generations. Archaeological evidence reveals that the city was abandoned with shocking suddenness around 761 AD, its monuments deliberately broken and its palaces systematically dismantled by enemies who sought not just military victory, but the complete erasure of their rivals' political and cultural identity. The collapse of individual centers like Dos Pilas might have been absorbed by the resilient political system of the classic period Maya, but the late 8th and early 9th centuries witnessed a cascade of similar failures that overwhelmed the capacity of surviving cities to compensate for their neighbors' decline. Copan, the Athens of the Maya world, ceased erecting dated monuments after 822 AD, marking the end of a royal dynasty that had ruled for over 4 centuries. Quirigua, Copan's former vassal that had achieved independence through a dramatic military victory in 738 AD, followed its former master into silence just a few years later. The collapse was not uniform across the Maya world, and its varied character reveals the complex interplay of environmental, political, and social factors that brought about the end of the classic period. Cities in the northern Yucatan, where cenotes provided more reliable water sources and where political systems had developed different characteristics from those of the southern lowlands, continued to flourish, even as their southern neighbors fell into ruin. Chichen Itza, in particular, emerged as a major power during the terminal classic period, demonstrating that Maya civilization retained the capacity for innovation and adaptation even during its most challenging period. The cultural achievements of the terminal classic period reveal a civilization that continued to pursue excellence in art, architecture, and intellectual endeavor, even as political structures crumbled around it. The murals of Bonampak, painted around 790 AD during the height of the crisis period, represent some of the finest artistic achievements in Maya history. These extraordinary works depicting royal ceremonies and military victories with unprecedented naturalism and emotional intensity demonstrate that the creative spirit that had animated Maya culture for centuries remained vital even as the political order that had sustained it began to disintegrate. Similarly, the astronomical and mathematical achievements of late classic period Maya reached levels of sophistication that would not be equaled anywhere in the world for centuries. The Venus tables of Copan, calculated during the final decades of that city's independence, demonstrated predictive accuracy that modern astronomers find remarkable. The eclipse predictions preserved in the Dresden Codex, compiled during this same period, reveal mathematical understanding that rivals modern computational methods in its precision and elegance. The religious responses to the crisis of the late classic period reveal both the strength and limitations of Maya spiritual traditions. Royal bloodletting ceremonies became increasingly elaborate and frequent as kings sought to maintain divine favor through ever more extreme acts of piety and devotion. Some rulers, like the final kings of Palenque, commissioned monuments that explicitly addressed the cosmic significance of the troubles that beset their kingdoms, framing contemporary difficulties within mythological narratives that provided hope for eventual renewal and restoration. Yet these spiritual resources, however profound and meaningful they may have been to the Maya themselves, could not overcome the material realities of environmental degradation, demographic pressure, and political fragmentation that were undermining the foundations of classic period civilization. The very success of Maya culture in creating dense urban populations and complex political systems had generated problems that exceeded the capacity of existing technologies and institutions to solve. The trade networks that had connected Maya cities with each other and with distant regions began to contract as political instability made long-distance commerce increasingly dangerous and unprofitable. Archaeological evidence reveals dramatic declines in the importation of obsidian, jade, and other luxury goods that had sustained elite culture for centuries. Local craft production also declined as patronage systems collapsed and artisans fled from unstable political centers to seek security in rural areas or other regions where political authority remained intact. The population movements of the terminal classic period created their own dynamics of instability as refugees from collapsed centers placed additional pressure on the resources of surviving cities. Some centers, like Saibal in the Passion River region, experienced brief periods of renaissance as they absorbed populations from failed neighbors, but even these temporary recoveries could not restore the overall trajectory of decline that was affecting the entire southern lowland region. The slow unraveling of the classic Maya world did not come with a single cataclysm, but rather as a long twilight, a fading of old certainties and the gradual extinguishing of lights that had once shone so brilliantly across the jungle. In city after city, the rituals that had bound earth and sky together continued, but the crowds grew thinner, the monuments smaller, and the kings less secure in their power. The mighty dynasties that had once traced their ancestry to gods and heroes now found themselves beset by challenges that no amount of bloodletting or prayer could overcome. In the southern lowlands, the collapse was both visible and invisible. Temples and palaces fell into disrepair, their stones scavenged for new shelters or left to the encroaching jungle. The great plazas that had once hosted thousands for ceremonies and festivals became silent, haunted only by memories and the cries of birds. Stelae, those upright stones that had proclaimed the glory of kings, ceased to be raised. The last dated monuments in cities like Tikal and Copan marked the passing of an age. Yet even as the old order faded, the Maya people endured. Across the countryside, farmers continued to plant maize, beans, and squash, drawing on knowledge passed down through generations. Village life persisted, adapted, and survived. The collapse of the divine kingship did not mean the end of Maya civilization, but rather its transformation. Power shifted from the hands of god-kings to local lords, councils, and communities, each finding new ways to organize life in a world where the old certainties had vanished. In the northern Yucatan, the story was different. Here, the great cities of the Puuc Hills, Uxmal, Kaba, Sail, and Labna, rose to prominence as the southern centers declined. Their architecture, with its intricate mosaic facades and soaring roof combs, spoke of a new aesthetic and a new confidence. Uxmal, in particular, became a beacon of innovation, its pyramid of the magician and governor's palace among the finest achievements of Maya architecture. The Puuc cities, though smaller in scale than the giants of the south, demonstrated that Maya creativity and resilience had not been extinguished. Most remarkable of all was the rise of Chichen Itza, drawing on influences from the collapsing south and from distant lands to the west and north. Chichen Itza became a cosmopolitan metropolis, a place where merchants, warriors, and priests from across Mesoamerica mingled in its markets and plazas. The city's architecture reflected this diversity. The Great Castillo Pyramid, with its astronomical alignments and serpent-shadowed stairways. The Temple of the Warriors, flanked by rows of stone columns. The Great Ball Court, the largest in the Maya world, where the echoes of ritual games still seem to linger in the air. Chichen Itza's power was not merely architectural or economic. The city became a center of new religious and political ideas, blending Maya traditions with influences from the Toltec civilization of central Mexico. The cult of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, rose to prominence, symbolizing a new era of synthesis and adaptation. The city's rulers, no longer claiming descent from the old southern dynasties, instead built legitimacy through innovation, trade, and the forging of new alliances. This era, known as the Terminal Classic and early Post-Classic, was marked by both continuity and change. The Maya calendar continued to mark the passage of days and the cycles of creation, but the long count inscriptions faded from the monuments, replaced by new forms of record-keeping and new expressions of power. Writing itself shifted with painted codices and murals taking precedence over stone stelae. The sacred ball game persisted, but its meanings evolved, reflecting the changing political and spiritual landscape. The Maya world was now a mosaic of city-states and regional powers, each navigating the uncertainties of a new age. Some, like Mayapan in the north, rose to brief prominence before succumbing to the same forces of rivalry and instability that had undone their predecessors. Others, like the small kingdoms of the Petén, clung to ancient ways, preserving traditions in the face of mounting external pressures. Throughout this twilight era, the Maya demonstrated a capacity for resilience and reinvention that belied the narrative of simple collapse. They adapted to new environmental realities, shifting their agricultural practices and settlement patterns to meet the challenges of drought and resource depletion. They forged new trade networks, linking the Yucatan with the highlands of central Mexico and the Caribbean coast. They reimagined their religious life, blending old gods with new and finding meaning in the cycles of loss and renewal that had always defined their world. But even as the Maya adapted, new threats gathered on the horizon. The rise of powerful neighbors, the increasing frequency of internal conflict, and the relentless pressure of environmental change all conspired to make stability elusive. The world that had once seemed eternal was now revealed as fragile, subject to the same forces of change and impermanence that governed the lives of mortals and gods alike. And so, as the post-classic dawned, the Maya entered a new chapter in their long and storied history. A chapter marked not by the divine kingship of old, but by the resilience of a people who refused to let the light of their civilization be extinguished even as the shadows lengthened across the land. As the embers of the classic Maya world cooled, a new dawn broke over the jungles and plains of Mesoamerica. The post-classic era, far from being a mere afterglow, became an age of reinvention, a time when the Maya, tempered by adversity, forged new paths and reimagined the meaning of civilization beneath the ever-watchful gaze of the sun and stars. In the north, the city of Chichen Itza rose to preeminence, its limestone temples and sacred cenotes drawing pilgrims, traders, and warriors from distant lands. The city's plazas thronged with the colors of foreign textiles, the scents of cacao and copal, the music of languages from the Gulf Coast to the highlands. Here the cult of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, united ancient Maya cosmology with Toltec influences from the Mexican plateau, symbolizing the fusion of old and new that defined the post-classic world. Chichen Itza's rulers no longer divine kings in the classic sense, but lords of commerce, diplomacy, and ritual presided over a city that was both fortress and marketplace. The Castillo Pyramid, with its 4 stairways and 365 steps, became a living calendar, its shadowed serpent descending each equinox to the eye of the gathered multitude. The sacred cenote, a well of emerald waters, drew offerings of gold, jade, and even human life, as priests sought the favor of gods and spirits in a world where certainty was no longer assured. Beyond Chichen Itza, the Pyu-Ux cities, Uxmal, Kaba, Sayal, Labna, flourished as centers of art and science, their mosaic facades gleaming in the tropical sun. Here the Maya perfected the corbel arch, creating palaces and temples of airy elegance. Astronomers tracked the movements of Venus and the Sun from observatories like the Caracol, ensuring that the cycles of time and ritual remained unbroken even as the world changed. Trade became the lifeblood of the post-classic Maya. Merchant guilds, protected by alliances, and armed escorts plied the coasts in canoes laden with salt obsidian, honey cotton, and the prized cacao beans that served as currency. Markets at Mayapan, the new northern capital after Chichen Itza's decline, buzzed with activity, linking the Maya world to distant polities in central Mexico, the Caribbean, and even the far-off Andes. Mayapan itself, encircled by defensive walls and governed by a council of noble lineages, became a symbol of both unity and fragility. For 2 centuries, it maintained a delicate balance of power, fostering scholarship, religious reform, and artistic achievement. The city's murals and codices, painted in vivid reds and blues, recorded histories, genealogies, and prophecies, preserving the wisdom of the ancients for generations yet unborn. In the highlands and along the coasts, other Maya polities thrived. The Quiche and Caciquel kingdoms of Guatemala built new capitals at Cumarcay and Iximche, their plazas alive with the thunder of drums and the chants of priests. Here the Popol Vuh, the great epic of creation and heroism, was preserved in whispered memory and painted glyph, ensuring that the stories of the hero twins and the lords of Xibalba would never be forgotten. Religion, ever adaptive, responded to the shifting realities of the age. The veneration of old gods continued, but new cults and syncretic practices emerged, blending Maya tradition with influences from Nahua, Mixtec, and Zapotec neighbors. Pilgrimages to sacred mountains, caves, and cenotes became more frequent as communities sought divine guidance in a world of uncertainty and change. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. The unity of Mayapan was fragile, threatened by the ambitions of rival lineages and the pressures of population and resource scarcity. In the east, the Itza and Kokom families vied for supremacy, while in the west, the Tutul Shu watched and waited, their eyes fixed on the shifting balance of power. The post-classic Maya world was a tapestry of resilience and adaptation. a civilization that refused to vanish into the jungle, but instead transformed itself anew. The cities might have changed the gods, might have donned new faces, but the spirit of the Maya endured undaunted, creative, and ever watchful for the next turning of the cosmic wheel. As the centuries passed and the Maya world adapted to each new challenge, the fabric of their civilization grew ever more intricate, yet ever more vulnerable. The unity that had defined Mayapan began to fray in the 15th century, torn by the ambitions of noble houses and the weight of old rivalries. The city's walls, once symbols of protection, now enclosed suspicion and intrigue. In 1441, a civil war erupted, and Mayapan's great halls were set ablaze, scattering its people across the Yucatan and plunging the region into a new era of fragmentation. In the wake of Mayapan's fall, the land splintered into dozens of independent polities, city-states, and small kingdoms, each ruled by its own batab or halach uinik, each fiercely guarding its autonomy. The Itza held sway over the lakes and forests of central Petén, their capital at Tayasal rising on an island shrouded in mist and legend. The Kokom, Tutul, Shu, and other noble lineages carved out domains across the plains and coasts, forging alliances and waging wars that ebbed and flowed with the seasons. Yet even in this age of division, the Maya spirit endured. Towns and villages thrived, their markets alive with commerce, their temples echoing with the prayers of priests and the laughter of children. The sacred calendar continued to guide the cycles of planting and harvest, of festival and remembrance. The Popol Vuh and the Chilam Balam books, written in secret and in silence, preserved the wisdom of ages past, blending ancient myth with the harsh realities of a changing world. It was into this world, resilient, proud, and fiercely independent, that the winds of fate began to blow from across the sea. In 1517, Spanish ships appeared on the horizon, their sails white against the blue of the Caribbean. The first encounters were marked by curiosity and caution, gifts exchanged and words misunderstood. But soon the true nature of the newcomers became clear. Armed with steel and gunpowder, driven by hunger for gold and souls, the Spaniards began their inexorable advance. The Maya met the invaders with courage and cunning. In the east, the people of Chetumal and the warriors of the Itza resisted with every weapon at their disposal, ambush and diplomacy, flight and defiance. The dense forests and tangled swamps became allies, hiding villages and confounding conquistadors. Battles raged at Champoton, at Nojpeten, at countless nameless places where Maya arrows met Spanish armor, and the jungle itself seemed to rise in defense. But the Spaniards brought more than swords. Disease swept ahead of their armies, silent and invisible, claiming lives by the thousands and weakening the bonds of community. Old rivalries flared as some Maya lords allied with the newcomers against their enemies, hoping to preserve a measure of power in a world turned upside down. Towns fell one by one, their temples toppled, their idols shattered, their rulers forced to kneel before foreign gods. Yet the final conquest was neither swift nor complete. The Itza of Tayasal held out for nearly 2 centuries, their island stronghold a beacon of defiance, until 1697, when Spanish cannon finally silenced the last independent Maya kingdom. Even then, resistance flared in the forests and mountains, in secret shrines and whispered prayers, in the stubborn survival of language and custom. The Maya world was forever changed. The divine kingship was gone, the great cities now ruins overgrown by saber and strangler fig. But the people endured. They adapted, as they always had, blending their traditions with those of the conquerors, preserving their stories in hidden texts and living memory, shaping a new identity from the fragments of the old. In the villages and towns of Yucatan, Chiapas, Belize, Guatemala, and beyond, the Maya spirit persisted. The sacred calendar still turned. The gods still listened, and the descendants of kings and farmers alike carried forward the legacy of a civilization that had outlasted empires and storms. The Maya world, battered by centuries of conquest and change, never surrendered its soul. In the aftermath of the Spanish invasion, as the banners of empire fluttered over ruined temples and foreign priests intoned new prayers, the Maya people entered an age of endurance, a long night in which the embers of their ancient civilization glowed quietly beneath the ashes of defeat. Yet, even as their kingdoms fell, the Maya did not vanish. In the highland valleys of Guatemala, in the forests of Chiapas, in the villages of Yucatan and Belize, they preserved the knowledge of their ancestors. The sacred calendar, the Tzolkin, continued to mark the passage of days. The stories of creation of the hero twins and the lords of Xibalba were whispered from parent to child, woven into the rhythms of daily life and the rituals of planting and harvest. The Spanish, determined to erase the old ways, burned codices and toppled idols, but the Maya spirit proved indomitable. In secret, scribes copied the wisdom of the ancients into new books, the Popol Vuh, the Chilam Balam, the annals of the Kachikals, preserving the memory of a world that refused to die. In hidden groves and mountain caves, offerings of copal and maize, continued prayers rising like smoke to the gods who had watched over the Maya since time immemorial. The colonial centuries were marked by hardship and resistance. Maya communities endured forced labor tribute and the relentless pressure of foreign rule. Yet, time and again, they rose in rebellion. The uprising at Mani, the caste war of Yucatan, the countless acts of defiance that flickered like lightning across the centuries. Each time the conquerors were reminded that the Maya were not relics of a vanished age, but a living people, proud and unbroken. Through it all, the Maya adapted. They learned new languages, adopted new crops and tools, and found ways to blend their traditions with those of the wider world. Churches rose beside ancient temples, saints took on the attributes of old gods, and the cycles of Christian and Maya festivals intertwined in a tapestry of faith and memory. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as scholars from distant lands rediscovered the ruins of Tikal, Palenque, Copan, and Chichen Itza, the world marveled at the achievements of a people whose history had once seemed lost. Archaeologists brushed away centuries of earth and vine to reveal the splendor of Maya art and architecture, the genius of their mathematics and astronomy, the poetry of their glyphs. The decipherment of the Maya script in the late 20th century brought to light the voices of kings and queens, priests and scribes whose words had waited 1,000 years to be heard again. But the true renaissance of Maya civilization came not from foreign scholars, but from the Maya themselves. Across Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, and Honduras, Maya communities reclaimed their heritage, reviving languages, rituals, and crafts that had survived in secret for centuries. Festivals honoring the maize god and the rain-bringer once again filled the plazas with color and song. Young people learned to read the glyphs of their ancestors, to count the days of the sacred calendar, to tell the stories that had shaped their identity since the dawn of time. In the 21st century, the Maya are more than the descendants of a vanished empire. They are a vibrant, diverse people, numbering in the millions, whose traditions continue to shape the lands they have called home for millennia. They are farmers and teachers, artists and activists, guardians of forests and keepers of ancient wisdom. Their voices are heard in the councils of nations and the classrooms of their villages, in the prayers offered at dawn and the songs sung beneath the stars. The ruins of the ancient cities stand as monuments, not to a lost world, but to the enduring power of memory and hope. The pyramids of Tikal and Uxmal, the ball courts of Copan and Chichen Itza, the painted murals of Bonampak, and the stelae of Quirigua, all are chapters in a story that continues to unfold, written in the living hearts of the Maya people. The Maya calendar, once rumored to foretell the end of the world, instead marks the endless cycles of renewal and rebirth. For the Maya time is not a straight line, but a circle, a great wheel turning forever beneath the gaze of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Each ending is a new beginning, each loss a seed for future growth. And so the story of the Maya endures a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of memory, and the eternal flame of civilization that no darkness can extinguish. The sun rises each morning over the ancient cities of the Maya, casting golden light across the silent plazas and moss-covered stones. Yet these cities are not silent in memory, nor are they empty in meaning. They stand as living witnesses to a civilization whose story did not end, but transformed, whose legacy endures in ways both seen and unseen, from the highlands of Guatemala to the shores of the Caribbean, from the bustling markets of Merida to the quiet villages deep in the Yucatan. In the present day, the Maya people number in the millions, their languages spoken in homes and schools, their traditions woven into the fabric of daily life. The sacred calendar is still consulted for planting and for marriage, for naming children, and for seeking the favor of the gods. Healers and daykeepers, inheritors of ancient wisdom, guide their communities with prayers and rituals that echo the ceremonies once performed atop the Great Pyramids. Across the Maya world, the revival of traditional arts and crafts has become a source of pride and identity. Weavers create huipiles, whose patterns recall the glyphs and cosmology of their ancestors. Potters shape vessels in the forms used by kings and priests 1,000 years ago. Musicians play marimbas and flutes, their melodies carrying the memory of ancient festivals. In every act of creation, the Maya honor their past and shape their future. The Maya have also become stewards of their archaeological heritage. Once foreign explorers and treasure hunters carried away stelae and jade, scattering the fragments of Maya history across distant museums. Now, Maya communities work alongside archaeologists to preserve and interpret the ruins, ensuring that the story told is not just one of lost glory, but of living continuity. Festivals are held at ancient sites where dances and prayers reconnect the people with the spirits of their ancestors and the land itself. Education has become a new frontier for Maya Renaissance. Schools in Guatemala, Mexico, and Belize teach children not only in Spanish or English, but in Quiche, Yucatec, Quechua, and dozens of other Maya languages. Young scholars study the glyphs and mathematics of their ancestors, learning to read the stones and codices that once seemed mute. Universities and cultural centers celebrate Maya literature, philosophy, and science, reclaiming a place for indigenous knowledge in the modern world. The Maya have also become voices for justice and guardians of the earth. In the face of deforestation, climate change, and the pressures of globalization, Maya leaders advocate for the protection of sacred forests, rivers, and mountains. Their understanding of ecology, rooted in centuries of observation and respect for the land, offers wisdom for a world in search of balance. In courts and councils, Maya activists fight for the rights of their people, for land, language, and dignity. The world, once blind to Maya achievement, now stands in awe of their legacy. Tourists journey from every continent to marvel at the pyramids of Chichen Itza and the murals of Bonampak, to walk the causeways of Uxmal and the ball courts of Copan. Yet the greatest marvel is not the stone and stucco, but the living culture that endures, adaptable, creative, and proud. The Maya story is not one of collapse, but of transformation. Empires may fall, cities may crumble, but the spirit of a people endures so long as memory is kept and hope is renewed. The Maya have weathered drought and war, conquest and oppression, yet each generation has found new ways to honor the old and welcome the new. In the sacred texts, it is written that the world is born and reborn in endless cycles, that the hero twins descend to Xibalba and rise again, that maize withers and returns with the rain. So too with the Maya, each ending is a beginning, each trial a lesson, each silence a prelude to song. As night falls over the jungles and mountains, as the stars wheel in the heavens, just as they did for the astronomers of Copan and Palenque, the Maya people gather in homes and plazas, in churches and under ceiba trees. They tell stories, they sing, they remember. The flame of their civilization, kindled in the dawn of time, burns on eternal, unbroken, and bright. Thus ends the saga of the Maya, not as a tale of ruins and endings, but as a living epic, a testament to resilience, creativity, and the enduring power of memory. The Maya civilization, complete in its history, remains unfinished in its future, a civilization without end, forever dreaming beneath the stars.